Hello, my name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Associate Director of Library and Museum Programming at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to today's Friends of the American Philosophical Society event with Mike Madeja on what is happening with educational outreach and audiences at the APS. I'm so glad that so many of you have been able to join us today. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. The APS acknowledges and respects their continued presence and perseverance, and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, their expertise, and provided opportunities for collaboration. As you can imagine, the COVID pandemic has forced the APS to rethink how it delivers its educational programs. While many museums and libraries have been forced to make difficult decisions in this time, which have led in some cases to furloughing or even firing their staff, the APS has been very fortunate to be able to keep everyone working, including the part-time staff we hire each year to serve as guides in our exhibition galleries, many of whom have worked at the APS for years. It's that ongoing support that has been so crucial to keeping the APS really what it is. As we find ourselves saying pretty regularly these days at the APS, every challenge is just an opportunity. As you'll hear in today's presentation, we've been thinking about the way in which the pandemic can help us improve the products that we offer, especially our educational products, and the ways in which we deliver them, especially as you've come to see over the last 8 or 9 months with us through digital means. You will be receiving an invitation to one more Friends of the APS event for 2021, and that's coming up next week on December 15th with the Friends opening of the virtual tour of Dr. Franklin, Citizen Scientist. Another great example of how the APS is innovating in a time of pandemic. You won't want to miss this chance to hear from Janine Bolt and Emily Margolis, the lead curators, about all that went into making the APS's first, and hopefully not last, virtual exhibition. A little housekeeping. We are using Zoom webinar today. I think if you've been to an APS Friends event before, you know the drill. So don't worry, you've all been muted. You're not going to accidentally interrupt our talk. If you have a question, we very much hope you'll ask it. We hope you'll use the Q&A feature, which is right down there in the bottom navigation bar. Click on that, type your question. You can do it at any time in the presentation. Mike and I are going to leave about 25, 30 minutes for the conversation in the second half of today's program. We are also happy to offer closed captioning for today's virtual discussion. If you would like to use it during the presentation at any point, please click on the CC button on the bottom navigation bar. It's right next to the Q&A button. And go ahead and use it, and you will see the captioning for the program. And so with all of that out of the way, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Michael Madeja is the head of education programs at the American Philosophical Society Library and Museum. Prior to joining the museum team in 2015, Mike filled education and visitor services roles at a variety of institutions, such as Ford's Theater, the National Air and Space Museum, and the Philadelphia Zoo. He currently serves on the board of the Museum Council of Greater Philadelphia and on the steering committee of the American Alliance of Museums Education Committee. His work on emerging museum professionals has been published in Care and Keeping of Museum Professionals. Mike holds an MAT in Museum Education from the George Washington University and a BA in Biological Anthropology from Temple. And as I said, Mike is going to pull his, he's going to come on the screen now. He's going to talk probably for about 25, 30 minutes, and then I'll come back on. We're going to have a nice conversation about what is going on with education and outreach at the APS. Take it away, Mike.
Great, thank you so much, Kyle. Let's see if I can make my slides work. Wonderful. I'm really delighted to be here with all of you today. I took a peek at the participants tab a little bit earlier, right before Kyle introduced me. I'm really excited to have a great mixture of friends and staff here. And I'm delighted to be able to talk to you and take this time to talk about what the Education Programs Department does, and what's happening with our audiences in this current time. It's always helpful to have a brief outline for any talk. So I'll introduce myself again a little bit more. I'll introduce the Education Programs Department as a whole, and then I'll go a little bit into the history of the department, how we were poised to go into 2020, basically at that point in time, and what we've been doing in 2020 and what we hope to do beyond. And as Kyle mentioned, plenty of time for Q&A, because I'm sure there will be some fun questions along the way. So a little bit about my background. I love these two opposing images that are on this slide. The top one is of me petting a rhino at the Philadelphia Zoo. And then the bottom image is one of me meeting an idol of mine, Dr. Howard Gardner, an APS member at a program that we did last year. And as Kyle mentioned, I started my career at the Philadelphia Zoo during undergrad, where I earned a BA in biological anthropology, and I have my Master of Arts in Teaching in Museum Education from the Museum Education program at George Washington University. I've been honored to be at the APS for the past 5 years, and it's been so nice to meet a couple of friends along the way, and I'm excited to meet some more of you today as well. And as you mentioned from my bio, I throw that line in there about volunteering and serving on boards in a national and local sense, just to let folks know that I make sure that the APS is represented in as many scales and ways and forms as possible. So being able to talk about the APS in those professional settings is a great help for the organization. Don't be scared by how much text is on this slide. I'll try to run through it pretty quickly and easily. But before going into what the Education Programs Department does, I want to give a little bit about who we are and how we approach things. The department itself is made up of myself, the head of education programs, our museum education coordinator, Allie Rossbond, and the part-time seasonal staff or the museum managers and guides. And as Kyle mentioned, we were really honored and fortunate to be able to maintain that staff throughout the year, thanks to funding from folks like you and public, national, local organizations as well, funding that help right there. We're also part of the Library Museum. We're in the Library Museum Programming Division right under Kyle, so it's a great mixture and a great spot to be. For us, we focus on these core tenets and principles listed on the right. Collaboration is just a great opportunity to be in the spirit of the APS. We find it to be a highly collaborative organization, the history and in the present state of the organization. So being able to work with local, national partners and really broadcast the message of the APS in as many ways as possible has been a great help for us. And we really take the spirit of collaboration quite seriously. Not too much to say outside of this point, but collections and missions focused. We really make sure that we spotlight the collections of the APS as much as possible. We know that folks who might not be familiar with the APS find these objects and these kinds of manuscripts and these documents and these rare books and media that we have to really be a touchstone for them to latch onto the wonders that is the APS. Mission focus, luckily we've had the same one for quite some time, and we're able to promote useful knowledge in every program that we do, and we make sure that we hold that mission dear to our hearts. We provide equitable access for Philadelphians and tourists. I throw tourists in there because it's a reality of where we are. We are right next to Independence Hall, so we do get a lot of tourists, and we want to cater to them just as much as we do local Philadelphians. But our core kind of mission is serving Philadelphians as much as we can. Equitable access for us just means that we focus on accessibility, whether it be mental and cognitive, emotional, or physical accessibility, make sure that everybody feels welcome in our exhibition spaces or during our programs. Most of the programs are free as well, and even admission to the museum exhibitions is free, thanks to support again. We invest in and between staff, meaning that we take our part-time seasonal staff seriously. We want them to come back every year. Like Kyle mentioned, we have many that come back every single year. There's one that's been with us since the museum opened. I'm sure you're all mostly familiar with Ursula, and we keep that spirit alive as much as we possibly can. We also want to be a resource for staff at the APS. Again, we have the opportunity to focus on physical accessibility and other core education principles, but that's not at the leisure of all the other staff. So being there for our coworkers is important for us in many ways. Authenticity and approachability is really important for the Education Programs Department in particular, where if we're interfacing with the public on a frequent basis, we want to make sure that the words American Philosophical Society, the nation's first learned society, aren't scary or unapproachable to people. We always put on a smile. We always wear quirky things like a Mastodon t-shirt or have friendly name tags so that folks feel welcome in our spaces and don't feel kind of intimidated by the history of the APS. We want everybody to feel welcome as much as possible. A lot of that goes into the authenticity as well. We know that giving tours from our own perspective and bringing in our life experiences is important for visitors to see that they can see themselves reflected in the organization. Reflection and iteration and evaluation and professionalism go together pretty closely, where it's a joke among museum educators that we have to reflect after every single thing that we do, after every single movement we take. So we sit down after every program season, and think to ourselves, what can we keep, what can we change, what can be made better, and did we serve our audiences well enough? And that goes into iteration. After those reflections, we can repeat those processes and repeat those program formats at a better quality. We love to evaluate. We make sure that we know that people are learning during our programs, and we make sure that folks, we can capture the demographics after every program or during every program as well. And professionalism, it is the nation's first learned society. The APS is a serious organization, so we want to make sure that we're representing members and staff in a highly professional manner and make sure that we're represented in our professional fields as well. And then there's a sense of humble pride that comes with the department. We know how wonderful the APS is. We know that you know how wonderful the APS is. But if we're at an outreach event like the Science Festival, it might be somebody's first time interacting with the APS. We make sure we don't take it in vain or in a too damaging of a sense. We just want to welcome them into the organization. So we don't put on airs at any single program, and we make sure that everybody feels welcome. Again, we know how great the APS is, and it's our job to kind of tout that at those programs. I'll throw in some quotes along the way. I think I only have two for this presentation, but I like reading them because it's an opportunity that we have to share them. This is from a colleague at the Museum of the American Revolution after they brought teachers to the APS during a summer teacher institute that they had. The quote reads, "Thanks so much for everything. I don't know if you caught this, but one of my teachers was in tears yesterday after looking at your primary sources." A second teacher told me that when she was recapping the experience later with her daughter on the phone, she was surprised to find herself choking up. She said it was like Disneyland for her, or like her daughter getting to see The Lion King. These are the powerful moments that we hope to bring to every single interaction, and this is the overall goal of the Education Programs Department, that people feel like they can share their experiences at the APS with each other, and that they feel welcome in those spaces. And again, that we're showing off the collections and making sure that we share the power of the organization with others. So how does that connect to what we actually do, and what do we actually get to do in the Education Programs Department? Our core tenet or our core focus is on education and outreach. We serve educators, teachers, and students, and we primarily focus on grades 4 through 12. Occasionally we'll get an undergraduate or graduate course or professor coming through with students, but we really do focus on that late middle school and high school grade range. The other focuses can come through our colleague Adriana Link in scholarly programming, so we like to balance it out in some ways. We also do outreach, as I kind of mentioned. We consider these to be opportunities when we're not on the APS campus, where we might be out in the city, out in other locations, or in schools even. So citywide festivals like the Philadelphia Science Festival is a great opportunity to engage with all Philadelphians in a quick, easy way. We also have some working relationships with schools like Roman Catholic High School, where we go into the schools and provide programming on a fairly regular basis, or at least prior to the pandemic, on a fairly regular basis. We also do on-site and virtual school programs and educator workshops. So really focusing on bringing students to the APS or teachers to the APS to learn about our resources through structured programming and structured opportunities for them. We also do public programming. We serve local adults and intergenerational groups or families. I'll use those words interchangeably throughout this presentation probably, and as well as those tourists. So again, just recognizing where we are and making sure that we serve visitors who do visit the APS consistently throughout the year. Almost all of those programs are free, and that's a great access point to talk about, where the admission to the exhibitions remains free no matter what, but the programs are also free that we put on. That means that an adult program can happen free. All of the crafts and materials that we provide for our activities for intergenerational family groups are free. We try to remove as many barriers as possible during these programs. The only time you might see a ticket charge is if we partner with another organization and they need to sell tickets to help with their own revenue streams. These programs are mostly related to the exhibitions. It's a great opportunity to really focus on a set of collections and have a strong theme of programs throughout a single year. But thanks to the library museum merger, we're allowed to break free from the exhibitions occasionally and really focus on the broader collections. So for example, the top picture is of a candy making demonstration we had last year that wasn't necessarily a great fit for mapping a nation shaping the early American Republic, but it was a great fit for our collections where there are some candy and cookbook recipes in the collections themselves. These all have educational aims and usually have a hands-on or quirky component to them. We try to keep our public programs distinct from, but complementary to the APS lectures. So really keeping them smaller, making them hands-on, and having a more kind of interactive sense to them is a good distinction point for those public programs. We also do visitor services and exhibition-specific education. This is where that part-time seasonal staff really comes in. The museum guides are a core part of this functioning. We serve all visitors to the exhibitions with an eye towards catering content and experiences to a non-scholarly audience. That's really where we step in to help the Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral curatorial fellows in balancing that hard line that the APS has to walk of serving an 8th grader and an APS member. It's a difficult thing to balance, but we do it so well because the exhibition staff and staff of the APS are so collaborative in balancing out perspectives and even word choices. Again, this comes in the form of labels, in-gallery education moments, and design. And we balance all these things out with the help of the guide staff who provide interactive moments and make sure that everything's accessible, inclusive, and secure. we want to make sure we're protecting the collections and visitors to the exhibitions. A great example is in the top picture. You can see a former museum guide, Alan, holding a 19th century compass that we had last year, and we still use that outreach programs when we can, showing visitors how a 19th century compass functions. It's one thing in the bottom picture to see them looking at it through the vitrine or the plexiglass, but it's another to be able to take something out and show a visitor that whole thing, have them touch certain parts of it and feel the materials in so many ways. So what have we been doing for the past couple of years? Through 2016 through 2019 is where I'll really focus. It's about the time that I came into the helm of the department, and 2019 was going to be a great launching pad for us into 2020 before the world shifted a little bit. In that time period, we've been able to move beyond the exhibitions again with many thanks to the library museum merger. We're not locked into the exhibitions. We can focus more broadly and work more broadly within the APS. There's no more siloing really, and we can have more collaborative opportunities internally than we might have before that merger happened. We're gaining more local audiences and really focusing on that. We know we'll get the tourists every year. We know that won't be a problem for us, but how do we build local audiences through those collaborations? How do we build local audiences through intentional outreach? How do we build them through interactive conversations with our members? We love consistency, templates, measuring, and systems. Kyle knows that I love thinking 3 months out all the time at any moment in time. So knowing that we can have consistent templates to rely on and kind of plug and chug programs along the way, but make sure that they're balanced out through things like measuring and other systems. So we want to reflect, we want to make sure that the programs are effective. There's also great leadership and knowledge sharing happening between and among staff across the board. And that really goes to the library museum merger connection point there, where now we can work with our colleagues in the Center for Digital Scholarship and talk about the digital galleries and exhibitions and how we might be able to weave in educational materials into those opportunities. So there's a lot of sharing between staff and a lot of leadership sharing, even within the education programs department. Typically, part-time seasonal staff might not be able to plan public programs, but we make sure that they're given that opportunity to build those skills and want to come back to the APS every year because they know it'll be a great professional cornerstone in their careers. The next couple of slides are a few charts just showing some of those improvements over time, but also where we're kind of aiming as far as accessibility and public programs and outreach goes. This is a quick chart on the number of accessibility features for the exhibitions. We've been able to work with local partners like ArtReach on really making sure that our exhibitions and our public programs are visitor friendly in so many ways. So we've moved beyond just having magnifying glasses available in the exhibitions, having large print labels, access kits for visitors who might have autism or come with someone who might have autism, large print labels again, and then even things like a walking cane stool combination or the guides being trained in using the wheelchair lift. Again, physical, emotional, cognitive accessibility are really important to us and making sure that that's a cornerstone of a lot of things that we do. If you're a returning friend or a staff member here, I'm sure you're sick of hearing these numbers, but it's an important thing to mention along the way. Throughout the museum's long history, exhibition visitation has only been increasing and increasing steadily and quite fantastically, honestly. 2019, there was over 190,000 visitors to that exhibition. 2020 was on deck to kind of blow that out of the water, especially being Benjamin Franklin focused. We could only imagine how many visitors were going to come. We're excited that we now have these virtual opportunities to show off the exhibitions and measure more of those numbers in the future. I also show this slide to kind of set you up for thinking about how 2020 has changed for us. 2019, we had to focus on maintaining quality and staffing and other exhibition fixes for over 190,000 visitors. This year, we had the luxury of not worrying so much about that. There weren't any weekend kind of quick fixes for covering staff. There weren't any weekend quick fixes for having over 3,000 people visit the exhibition in a single day. There were some mental and energetic capacities that were created in 2020 by not having a physical exhibition in some senses, though we miss it very, very dearly and are excited for 2021 to have hopefully a sense of a physical exhibition. The same thing goes with outreach programs. It's been a big focus for us, and particularly the education coordinator, Ali Rosbond, to go to outreach programs to represent the APS throughout Philadelphia. So again, these are things like the Philadelphia Science Festival. John Hines Wildlife Refuge also has an annual Fall Fest, and representing the APS throughout all the pockets and corners of Philadelphia through these programs. Last year was the pinnacle of that. We were hoping to repeat it again, but being able to kind of take that beat, breathe a little bit, and not worry about going all the way into deep Southwest Philly for a whole afternoon, being able to focus that energy elsewhere that you'll see in 2020. This is a great one on the student outreach or student reach for the past 4 years. 2018 was when we launched our flagship school program on yellow fever using the letters from the WIC collection. And it was also the 275th anniversary of the APS. There was a lot of energy around 2018 building up to the launch of that school program and the kind of consistency in building that we wanted to do. The kind of slight dip there isn't too large if you look at school groups mostly bringing 50 to 100 students at a time. This is a number that we were hoping to increase this year, but we had to focus on shifting things to a virtual format instead. And a quick precursor to how we've shifted into a virtual world, another great quote from a teacher. The quote reads, "Thank you again for the happy hour idea and all the resources. I'm often a little zoomed out, but I really appreciate all you have done and are doing to support teachers. The APS workshops I've gone to are some of my favorites. Thank you so much for connecting APS to schools and teachers. I look forward to more collaboration." And this fully sets up where we've gone in 2020 in so many ways. One, a happy hour idea with resources for teachers is a great fit for how we build community among our educators and build out the resources for them to work together, but also build in space for them to talk to each other. That's what they need right now, is a sense of community. We provide that space pretty often for educators in our network. And again, support and appreciation are massive words that we use for teachers and when we talk to our other audiences and collaborative partners. And I love that she mentioned other workshops that she's gone to in the past, noting that people can come back to these workshops year after year because we do try to change the themes, and that again helps with those exhibition themes changing. But also, the breadth and depth of the APS collections allows us to do a lot with teachers and for classrooms. And again, collaboration, ending on that note, is a really great way to circle back to those approaches and philosophies where we keep these things in mind and keep those at the core of what we do. So what did we really do in 2020? Surprise, surprise, we've gone digital. We've really moved this year to focus on teacher and classroom resources. Prior to this year, we didn't really have the capacity or the opportunity to sit down and build out web pages on our main page that have all of these resources. There were a couple scattered throughout the website, but the slower beat in the opportunities to think about 2020 allowed us to really flesh that out. And I'll share some examples later about what those are. We've really focused again on that internal resource building and reshaping. A lot of content created this year, but how do we move that content into being a classroom resource or a resource for folks at home who might be teaching along the way? This has also, again, allowed us to work more closely with our colleagues throughout Link and Scholarly Programming and in the Center for Digital Scholarship, and how can we all work together and think about how our programming, our efforts, our resources all fit certain audiences and their needs. And really back into that idea of humble pride, we've done a number of great educator workshops this year, but they'll mostly watch recordings or read the slides and reach out to us after the workshop. It's a hard year for a lot of people. We have to realize that we're not always going to be the #1 priority for some of our audiences. And we have to allow the opportunity for them to bounce back to us when they do have the mental and emotional space. So we've been recording programs. We've been sharing things after we do the programs, making sure that they have an access point outside of the hour that we might be putting things on. So again, knowing that if a program only has 20 attendees instead of the imagined 40, that's a great takeaway for us. And that's been a really great opportunity to hear people reply to emails that are sent after programs and know that they've appreciated the efforts that we put in, making sure that they can attend later on in some sense. I laugh at the idea of pausing and reflecting because I think we all know that pausing this year hasn't really been an opportunity. But for us, again, if we think about the lack of outreach programs or going out into certain locations in Philadelphia and the opportunity to breathe without dealing with 190,000 visitors, there's been a weird opportunity to pause and reflect for us. And it's really allowed us to think about how we put our resources onto the website, make sure that we present the website in our digital formats as a resource for families, teachers, and adults along the way as well. So this is just some of the digital resources that we've created this year. And I would like to point out that none of these ones in particular were on the website prior to March 2020. These have all been built out by myself, Ali Rossbaum, the education coordinator, and even the museum guides who have now been able to work on more remote projects throughout the APS. So this was a massive team effort. And luckily, again, we've had that time and that opportunity to build these out for our audiences. I'll run through them pretty quickly. APS at Home is an opportunity to download PDFs that have quick make and take activities that we would normally do in the summer with families. So things ranging from how to make a currency that Ben Franklin might have made to making a weather vane. Great opportunities for quick either art, science, or history-based activities at home. Career Chats has been a wonderful case of taking something that was launching into this year that we've had to make virtual. The state and Philadelphia have updated their career readiness and education standards to focus a little bit more on career prep and what careers look like. We were going to we had 2 more career fairs lined up to go to in 2020 that were canceled due to the pandemic. We were really wondering, how do we transform something into a virtual format? And that's where Career Chats came in, with having conversations among staff members, ranging from conservation down to Marilyn Vignola, who was the most recent one, special assistant to the executive officer, and talking about what their careers look like, how to put a human face on the APS, and also connecting to PA career readiness and education standards along the way. Color Art Collections is a great down-tempo activity. It's like a coloring book, but of APS collections, with some spotlights along the way that give a little bit more information about what those resources are. Great case of internal collaboration, again, is with education materials for digital exhibitions and galleries. Being able to pair all of that great work that the Center for Digital Scholarship has done over the years with things like suggested classroom activities, keywords for educators to search, things like that make it easier to kind of digest and think about how to use those applications in the classroom. Editing the declaration actually comes out of that workshop that the first quote is from. So looking at our copies of the Declaration and seeing how you can either think like Thomas Jefferson in editing them, or dealing with feedback while editing, or even comparing the Declaration to other kind of legacy documents like Dolores Huerta's commendation on the grape worker, the Delano grape workers, things like that, to make sure that it's modern and approachable for where people are at in the classroom today. Letter writing was an obligatory thing for us because we always get the complaint and the kind of note that it's hard for people to read cursive or manuscript handwriting. So we wanted to build out a resource fully dedicated to that, with templates on how to write an 18th century style letter in the form of Mad Libs, down to how to actually read and write in cursive. And it's been a fantastic opportunity to work on that and share those resources. And I would be fully remiss to not mention all of the resources and care and work that went in across the APS Library Museum on the Benjamin Franklin's American Enlightenment, or the NEH Cares projects. All of those projects have educator resources to go along with them. And the virtual tour is split into 2 tracks, where you can even take one that's really targeted towards 6th through 8th graders, or a youth track instead. And then the Yellow Fever, or that flagship school program, that's also been made into a virtual opportunity now. And we're hoping to book programs from January 2021 onward. And really thinking about going beyond 2020 in some senses. And a lot of the time this year has been spent thinking about how we can actually do all of this and keep the education programs department sustainable and in a continuous state of growth through 2021 and beyond. So we're already looking towards 2026, but we don't want to be left in the lurch in 2027 thinking that, we built all these things there's no more use for that at some point in time, right? So we're really making sure that anything we build for 2026 is sustainable. And that involves things like talking to stakeholders, which I'll talk a little bit about later as well. And how do we leverage all of those digital resources from that previous slide? How do we focus not so much on creating that content, but sharing that content with our audiences and intended audiences at that point in time? And again, we're going to go back into increasing teacher networks and student reach, launching those virtual school programs or virtual field trips, and also getting into the virtual sphere of teacher conferences like the Pennsylvania Council for Social Studies. We were poised to do a lot of those things in 2020, so we're going to pick that back up now that we have digital resources to share in 2021. Again, focusing on public programming quality and quantity balances. How do we make sure that staff isn't burnt out, but how do we also make sure that we produce enough quality public programming to reach audiences as much as possible? And again, we're really excited to focus on collections outside of the exhibitions and really continuing to do that and continuing to build out those networks that make sure that we have knowledge about what's in the collections beyond the exhibitions. And I'm pretty excited about the opportunities now to create footholds in education and public programming that spans the APS collection areas. How do we get a teacher to think, my 4th graders are learning about Native American and Indigenous peoples in my area. What educator resources can I turn to? We want folks to think of the APS for something like that. How do we get the history of science and anthropology into high school classrooms for a teacher who might not know what the history of science is? And now that we have the David Center for the American Revolution, how do we work better with our neighbors on making sure that if they do a field trip to the Museum of the American Revolution to focus on objects, maybe they come to the APS to focus on primary sources and documents. Thinking about those things, making sure we build all of that out, even in early areas like early American history, where that yellow fever program does have a good fit so far. And I said reflection in the beginning, so I can't not bring it up at the end. Thinking about the takeaways from 2020 for 2021 and beyond, we're really continuing to build our audience reach and impact through the support of friends from the APS members, local, state, and federal organizations. Is thinking about the capacities and the opportunities that we've had this year, especially with having the museum guides focus on other projects, not just visitor services. That support's allowed us to build all of these digital resources, and it's a great opportunity for the staff as well to build out those skills and really focus on education as a whole. We're also focusing on some citizen science projects with local communities, really working towards a set of 3 exhibitions that focuses on science in some way, and seeing how we can work more closely with schools or urban gardens and building out those citizen science projects, but really focus on what those communities want and need from the APS in so many ways. We're also focusing on trauma-informed practices and thinking about that in a pretty deep way, where the yellow fever program is focused on an epidemic. We've just lived through and are living through a pandemic. How do we make sure that lesson plan doesn't trigger any damaging responses in students or anybody else who might be involved in the program, but make it safe and welcoming and a space to talk about it and reflect about the experiences that we've all gone through this year. Again, the virtual school programming goes nicely with that point. Now that we have the virtual tour of Dr. Franklin, citizen scientists, and we've built out this network of opportunities through the Yellow Fever program, taking that virtual this year now that we have all the digital resources in place to make sure that it's launchable and viable. And again, we'll think about starting with stakeholders. This is a great opportunity for us to start with the end users in mind and start talking to the end users. It's a great practice across museum education and public history, but really thinking how we structure conversations from the endpoint instead of creating a product and then sharing it. So how do we build something like the Revolutionary City portal by talking to teachers, scholars, and other people before we actually launch the project itself, and making sure that we have those conversations before we get too far into the planning process along the way. Okay, and that was all I had for, for the formal portion of the presentation. I'm happy to chat with any questions that you might have. And again, I think we're using the Q&A feature for those questions as well.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. Questions are already started rolling in. So we have about 20 minutes or so in the program. So, and I, of course, always have questions for you. So first, so I want everyone to know that Mike is my go-to person for reflective practice within the Library Museum program. I think that museum educators and public historians have known for a long time the importance not just of doing, but of also sort of thinking about what they've done. And maybe, Mike, I can put you on the spot a little. So what would be a few words that would come to mind when I say 2020? You know, what are the words that pop into your head?
Pause is always one of them. I think, like, fully pausing and thinking about it's been a massive year of assessing what we have readily available, right, and checking that out and making sure that we have the time and the capacity to build those digital resources. And that pausing this year that was brought on by being able to kind of like thinking about visitor services and those kinds of operations and public and outreach programs has allowed us to actually build all of these things in so many ways. Where I think the other word that I have to think about for it is build, like pause and build. Building those digital resources, and even with things like the Revolutionary City portal, building stakeholder groups is an amazing opportunity that has been presented through this whole year, and these opportunities that have been brought to us in some ways by 2020. So
build is not a new thing for you, right? And I think your 5 years have very ably demonstrated, and I think your charts speak to this, and it speaks to one of the questions that was posed. You know, you've just gone a year without 190,000 people coming through. How do you, what do you account for how we got to that point? You know, what was it that got us from would you have 69,000, 70,000 in 2016, 2017, up to 190,000? Where did that big growth come from?
Yeah, and I fully have to admit that I rest on the laurels of every single staff member that came before me in those ways where they built these kinds of audience outreach efforts through artist projects, other kind of grant-funded opportunities. But some of the exhibitions were shorter in length. That's part of it, where the 8.5 month, 9 month period has allowed us to increase that visitation. We've regulated again systems thinking, regulated the hours more consistently to be Thursday through Sunday, 10 to 5, instead of kind of like changing throughout the year. Within the past 3 years, I think it was, for the Peel exhibition in 2018, we had the opportunity, with approval from the Park Service, to add a museum sign that speaks to the one that Charles Wilson Peel had on the back of the building. That brings in visitors as well. And we just keep maintaining and building these working relationships that we have with the park, with Visit Philly, with other people in the area. And that collaborative effort really also helps bring audiences to the APS in those exhibitions.
I think we can share, and some of the friends who remember last fall will, maybe remember seeing us sort of casually in our, kind of astonishment, right? That by October, we had already hit the previous year's, cap. And that the numbers just kept coming. And I think we had a slightly warmer fall too, right? So those things sort of factor into all the things that you're saying. But think about now, right? And, so if you're my go-to on reflective practice, you're also my go-to on assessment, right? Yeah. And you have, you've been a very good and strong voice about assessment and its importance. What does that look like? I mean, what do numbers mean now? And I think that's one of the things that I'm curious about. How important were those numbers for you? Or who are they important for? And now that those numbers are different, and what are the numbers now? How do you sort of know you're doing the right thing? And I know that's a really tough question, but I'm just curious, your kind of thoughts.
Yeah, no pressure on that question. I've been thinking so deeply about what numbers look like in a digital space, because as any other folks on this call might know, I'm not a digital person in any way, shape, or form. I really don't exist that well in the digital sphere. So thinking about what numbers look like for the virtual tour itself, measuring that, I haven't figured out a way to actually fully capture the numbers and think about that way, right? But this year, assessment-wise, has really been a switch to qualitative over quantitative. So getting more long-form responses to things, that's where those quotes can come from, and really show more of the deeper thinking that's going behind something, instead of saying, yeah, I would rate that a 4 out of 5, 3 out of 5, right? So having the qualitative response shows a bit of deeper thinking. That's where I've been switching to for a lot of this. And thinking longitudinally, having those kinds of built in, and trying to capture either how many people might be viewing something from a household instead of just a camera-to-camera point as well. So shifting a lot of that to actually match how people use the technology that's available to them.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think it's a new world for us.
Yeah.
and there's a great question here from James Hill, good friend of the APS, about looking towards the future and when we get back to school visits, right? A sort of cornerstone program that you do, and if we are getting back to those in April or May, God willing, the vaccine works, and so I want to ask, is that sort of the plan? But also, is there going to be something that you took away from 2020 that's going to make specifically those school programs maybe look different?
Oh, absolutely. In part, it is that trauma-informed practice. We, especially with that program in particular, but it's also a common emerging practice for urban schools in general, to really focus on what questions you ask and how you ask those questions, the program formats, to make sure you're not triggering any sort of responses that might be negative. So making sure that everything has that trauma-informed lens in some sense. But then the most beautiful thing from all of these assessments and all these forums and all these programs that we've done this year is seeing the number of people who either are a first-time joiner for an APS program or are coming back to an APS program for the first time in so long, and making sure that that's something that we can maintain in those as we resume things, and making sure that we can still bring in those people to the APS. It's the American Philosophical Society, right? So we don't have to be totally locked into Philadelphia. So really thinking about how we make those school programs virtual and maintaining that setup through organizations like I always get this acronym wrong, it's CILC, the Collaborative Interactive Learning Community. So how do we still do that as we open back up to the public and in-person visitation?
So it's easy maybe to say, we're going to do trauma-informed programming.
Yeah.
It's harder to do it,
Yeah.
right? And maybe you could just, for our audience, pull back the curtain a little bit. You know, where are you now? Where would you need to be in April to actually be able to do that sort of meaningful program? And I think you had a little experience sort of thinking through a grant on this, right?
Right. Yeah. So in thinking about, and the great opportunity about having applied to that was doing some of the basic research in how this applies to the museum world. A lot of the trauma-informed practices are very social work focused and not in direct application to museums. So taking more time to find those resources or purchase those resources in some sense. There's one book on museum practice in a trauma-informed way, building that kind of library out in some senses, but also working possibly with a social worker or a consultant on those projects, making sure that an outside voice is saying, yes, that looks okay to me. So really making sure that we have the balance of external resources on the internal project.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important that I think again goes back to appreciating our own limits, right? So we are scholars, we are museum history professionals, but we are not trained in the methodologies of conflict resolution all the time. We're not trained in the ideologies of trauma. I think its applicability, of course, right? It's not just limited to yellow fever. And there's a wonderful way too, right, that we can also maybe better appreciate the 1790s and that pandemic, right, as a result of this pandemic. Are there ways that you're thinking about new connections that maybe you didn't see before? Or
it's the power of that lesson where it was relevant before the pandemic, even in some senses, where we focus on the Black nurses in the Free African Society helping out in the effort to take care of Philadelphians in so many ways during that lesson plan and that activity for schools. But we also focus on wealth disparities. A lot of the people who fled Philadelphia in 1793 could do so because they had the financial means to leave the city. They had the financial means to have a house in the countryside in Germantown, where these people were. So really focusing on those aspects and fleshing this out a little bit more and shifting back from some of the medical practices that we focused on in the lesson and creating space to have larger conversations within that about race and wealth disparities in epidemics.
Yeah, no, I think it'll be important, and it'll be, you know, as you look ahead to the work that you have for the next couple of months, right? There's sort of the balance for opening a new exhibit. There's a balance for resuming where you were before. And then, you know, it's figuring out how do you make that time, right? To sort of bring those other voices in. How do we find the resources, frankly, right? To be able to, give a stipend to the professionals who can help us with this thinking.
Right. I kept thinking early on in the pandemic that 2020 is just going to be the year with the asterisk. Now I'm like, oh goodness, it's going to be 2020 asterisk, 2021 different symbol, and just thinking about how to get back to where we were while also increasing is going to be the challenge for 2021, 2022.
Right. Well, and it raises that question is education just getting back to, or is it a new sort of hybrid model going forward? Are there other things that you're thinking about that this year maybe has opened your eyes to or given you a little breathing room to think about that you're kind of anxious, experimental programs that you might be rolling out?
Probably yes. Like really thinking about what visitation to the exhibition looks like in particular, right? And thinking about how we utilize the museum guide staff and their skills in so many ways is going to be really important for me in 2021, and thinking about how we use those projects that they created this year or that they worked on this year for 2021 and possibly even beyond. So one museum guide worked with Digital Franklin Fellow Bethany and digital project specialist Cynthia Hyder on a set of resources around the Franklin public post office ledgers. And so hoping to have a program in the summer that came out of this based on digital media literacy and data literacy, and how do we do that, which is going to have to be like a hybrid in-person digital format where people have to do open data things on their computers. Sounds fun. I hope it's going to be fun, but again, like I'm not a digital person, so the experimentation has to go into that to make sure that it has the kind of light, quirky fun that an APS public program brings, with the very serious kind of takeaways of you're learning how to use data and read data in a legitimate and kind of ethical sense.
You're getting at one of the things that I think is the real value in the integration
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
Library Museum, which has been happening over the last year. And maybe you could just talk a little bit more. What are the things that your beloved colleagues maybe sometimes get wrong when they're thinking about working with an audience that is adult learners or intergenerational or K through, or 4 through 12? What are some of the things that seem to come up that they maybe don't think about or they assume incorrectly and that you're able to kind of steer them right towards?
I mean, I have to say too that like it's a very mutual thing where like all the digital things, all the scholarly things, even like it's an open conversation between all of our colleagues, right? Where like I don't know a lot about the history of science or how to do the kind of digital programming that other folks on our staff do, so I'm learning as well along the way. I think it's a weird thing to say. I think people get too nervous when they think about doing something for the public in some sense, where the pausing of like what is an audience and that being like a stopping point for somebody is kind of it's a thing that Ali and I talk about constantly about like, okay, so how do we give a really clear definition on what an adult who's interested in data literacy looks like? Like, how do we give that so that they can create these programs in that way? And that's the beauty of the integration, where instead of building out that program and then asking us about the audience, it's going in the opposite direction and starting with the audience and then building out that program, which has been a great kickoff and switch. Even again with the Revolutionary City portal, it's starting with stakeholders, right? It's that point and being able to have those conversations through integration. But I would even say like the interesting idea, like you and I talk about this all the time, Kyle, about it's not useful to say K-12 most times. We all know that a kindergartner is not going to function the same way as a high schooler does in a space. So if you're thinking about an audience or you're thinking about an educational program or outreach thing, it's got to be specific to a grade level if you're going to go for a school program. So having everybody think about that a bit more in depth and think about the small things like motor functioning, even like pausing and thinking about how they might use these things has been a really great conversation, which also slows Ali and I down to then think about and re-explain those things that might be inherent practice for us. It's been great to actually talk about those parts of what we do.
Apologies for my doorbell going on through your answer. A lot of deliveries here. The joys of working remotely. This idea you've talked about a few times about stakeholders. So who's a stakeholder? What does that sort of mean for the APS? Is it a member? Is it a friend? Is it a community? Who are our stakeholders, and what does it mean for us to say we have stakeholders?
Right. It's a broad term and a specific term at the same time, where like inherently, because we're doing something with the APS, that includes the major stakeholders like members and friends, right? Like and staff. Those are always guaranteed to be some sense of a stakeholder. But for certain projects, it's a stakeholder is the end user, if you want to think about it that way instead, right? So if we're building a digital portal for things about the American Revolution and documents that want to showcase different narratives, we shouldn't build that thing first and then bring that to the audience that we have in mind, like a scholar, like a community member, like a teacher. We should have all three of them talking to us and each other at the same time about what that product should look like and how they're going to use it and what they want to get out of it. Because it's one thing for us to make objectives for something, but odds are that doesn't always match the objective that like a scholar in early American history might have instead.
I think one of the concerns that you often hear on the scholarly side is, well, but I'm the curator, right? Or I'm the expert, I'm the subject specialist, I know about that. And we talk in public history a lot about the idea of sharing authority.
Yeah.
And what does that mean to you? What does it mean from the perspective of the APS to, how do we put a curator who spent her entire career studying a topic in dialogue with somebody who hasn't? What is that? What does that look like, and why is it important to do it?
Yeah. I think it also relates really, really closely to the idea of humble pride, right? Where I think a great story I heard about a colleague who worked at a museum in DC, I won't name which one, but was at a conversation with the curator on an exhibition. And then the curator actually stood up and started pounding his fist on the table going, "I am the curator!" No point, right? What good does that produce? How does that help anybody at that point in time, right? So making sure that you step back and realize that the scholarship you're producing is for people. Talk to those people about how that scholarship impacts them. Likewise, a teacher realizing that they might not know everything that they know, or they've been teaching the same thing for 15 years and that went out of date 10 years ago. So then talk to the scholar and get updated on that. And the importance for me within all of that is thinking about the types of questions and how you question these things, and making sure that it's like a reflective thing along the way, that you're questioning how you do your practice and how you use things instead of you're questioning the date of something.
I still remember I was teaching a course in my previous career where we were working on a historic library catalog. And we were thinking about, all right, so we're making this new digital project. It's an old library catalog, but for 21st century users. And I had assumed all along that everybody knows how to use an online library catalog today, because I do it every single day. There's not a day that goes by that I do not use either the APS's online catalog or the Library of Congress or WorldCat. And my students are just kind of staring at me, and we're talking about design. And they say, I think more people use Amazon or Google, right?
Wikipedia,
the
right?
global search bar.
Yeah.
And I was like, right, you are right, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if we actually want people to use these things, we have to meet them where they're at, right? We have to know what their expectations are, what their comfortability is. So are you optimistic with our Rev City project that we're going to get there?
Yeah, because the whole project team has talked about this regularly, right? About making sure that those opportunities for conversation between the experts that we have as a stakeholder group and committee and panel have the opportunity to learn from each other, where we're pausing and thinking about what is a finding aid and how do you use it, right? And how you do that research on a digital portal like the APS anyway. It's been a great learning curve, both for me working in an archival institution like the APS, but learning how to do this research along the way where I'm still learning. So it'll really help to have those conversations with everybody in that sense. But again, pausing and really thinking about daily practice for some, not being daily practice for others.
So a big question that I know you wrestle with a lot is, what does it mean to be mission-centered? And what does it mean to have the APS's mission? And how do you find that really does inform the work you do?
Yeah, I remember when I first started, I was like, oh, promote useful knowledge. That's a free pass to do whatever you want. Because most things can be considered useful knowledge. It's an easy thing to spin. But really pausing and thinking about it, listening to my coworkers, going to member talks, participating in the APS culture, you learn that it's a little bit something more special than that. That it is knowledge that has a direct application or a direct kind of meaning for somebody, something, or a larger society. And that really makes it impactful and meaningful in so many senses to me. So that's where our public programs and even the school programs, we bring in these hands-on components or these highly reflective questions to make sure that you're either learning a skill through the knowledge that you just gained, even if it's something quirky and fun that matches Charles Wilson Peele, like a taxidermy program that we did one time, or if it's through that school program, the Yellow Fever one, where you're questioning what do economics have to do with an epidemic, and really making sure that you have that balance. It's not just fun facts, it's something that's practical and meaningful in so many senses.
I think it's wonderfully struck me in my time at the APS, coming out of the university, where mission statements get revised generationally, right? I mean, they are often highly reflective of the times, or aren't, right? And then cause problems and then are forced to sort of catch up. It's kind of, I mean, genius is not a word we want to throw around too lightly, but how is it that the APS in 1743 kind of got it right from the very start? I mean, we've got the broadside where it lays it all out and we're still adhering to it. I don't know if the institutions you've been at have been similarly sort of long focused in their wisdom, or if they've also been sort of always adaptive or reactive.
It's such a strong mix of both, but I can never stress enough to anybody that I've either worked with in a previous organization how unique the APS is in that way, where it's already a multifaceted organization at the start. It's not just a membership organization, it's not just a library or archive, it's not just a museum, it's all three at the same time, consistently at the same time. So it's so complex, and to have a seemingly simple mission statement like that, but also have a long history to draw those ideas of collaboration and working with other organizations in the area out and tease that out and add that to the mission. It's such a unique and powerful opportunity in so many ways.
And it's the generosity.
Yeah.
It's the generosity of the Friends of the APS who've given their time this afternoon to join us and who've given of their talents and of their resources. It's the generosity of the members, of our staff, of the foundations. I think there were a few representatives of the foundations on the call today. Thank you for all the ways that you've enabled Mike and his team to do their work. You know, it's an equally generous place, right? It's an inspiring place, but it's also a place where people realize that there's opportunities to support this work.
Right, and without that support, we can't do things like the accessibility features. We can't have the museum guides maintained, again, in the rare circumstance in the Philadelphia cultural landscape throughout the pandemic. We can't do some of those public programmings for free, or the exhibition admission can't be free, and we can't even think about reduced admission for school programs without that support. So, and thinking about that generosity across the board is so important to the work that the whole department does. It's critical. Yeah.
Well, I hope everyone on the call will join us next week for the Friends opening on the 15th. Very excited to see what Janine and Emily have to share with us about this new virtual tour. Thank you, Mike, for sharing all of your wisdom with us today. And thank you for a great 2020. I know, as you said, it was not the 2020 you expected, but you've made it you've made it pretty wonderful. So thanks, everyone, and we will see you next week.
Thanks so much, y'all, for joining.